Welcome to The Backstory with Dr. Ricky Singh. This podcast is focused on bringing you the latest research-based information about dramatically improving health, well-being, and quality of life. And here's your host, Dr. Ricky Singh.
Hey everyone, welcome to The Backstory. And this is kind of the second part of our COVID-19 episode. We talked a few episodes ago on the safety of the vaccines, the different options there are, why it's important to get it, and just in carrying that information to the next level, I brought our guest to the show today to talk about those kinds of things. Not only about healthcare disparities, but a situation called vaccine hesitancy that I think we should address in order to achieve what we're all looking for in getting through this pandemic, which is a herd immunity. One of the topics that keeps coming up is the information and misinformation out there about the vaccine. Who should get it, who shouldn't get it, and who are the groups of people most likely not to get it. And that's why I brought our guest today. So my guest is an associate professor of clinical medicine. She also serves as the vice chair for diversity for the Department of Medicine at Weill Cornell, and some of her many, many interests include the psychosocial aspects of medicine, physician wellness support, diversity in the healthcare force, access to care, and healthcare disparities. So I'm really excited. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Susana Morales. Dr. Morales, welcome to The Backstory.
Thank you for having me.
Certainly, there's a number of things I want to address, especially about the COVID vaccine. And again, a lot of the information or misinformation out there that affect our patients. So far, the United States has done, in my opinion, a pretty tremendous job with the vaccine rollout. I think both administrations were critical in securing the vaccine, and then also in our current administration in terms of distribution. So far in the United States, we have administered 250 million doses of the vaccine. And here in New York State, which does lead the way, we've administered 17 million, and almost 40% of the state is vaccinated. So this is all really great news. But the challenge is there is still a group of individuals who don't want to get vaccinated. And there's some that say, I'm young, I had COVID in the fall, I have immunity, I don't really want to get that vaccine. So I guess the first thing is, what do you say to those patients who choose not to get vaccinated? Why is it important that they be part of this solution?
This issue of vaccine hesitancy, vaccine confidence, acceptance is actually pretty complicated. It's also a bit of a moving target. It has been evolving. Back in November, when talk that vaccines were coming down the pike, I started to ask my patients about the vaccines, and several of them were like, I don't want to be the first one. From the beginning, people were asking me questions like, well, I heard that it can give you COVID, and a lot of rumors around it. So some hopefulness, because of course we were all desperate for, I think certainly the healthcare workforce was very desperate for vaccines, but also already the rumors were going around. So I think that some of the lack of confidence, the skepticism, the fear has been fueled by lots of things, including the rumor mill, a lot of information on social media that may not be accurate. Unfortunately, a lot of things have been also very politicized. And so I don't think public health should be politicized. I think it's all just around public health, but that has made it a little bit more complicated as well. So that said, I think it's normal for people to be anxious when there's a new thing happening, a new vaccine, especially new vaccine technology. And it's also in the setting of an ocean of anxiety that we've been living in for over a year, living and dealing with the pandemic. So I promised my patients that I would do the deep dive into the research, that I would read all the studies. Most questions that people have asked me are completely legitimate and brilliant, actually. There have been questions that people have asked me that I have not known the answer to, and I've had to go back and investigate. So what I learned, number one, is that the vaccines that have been approved in this country are very, very effective, and they are safe. And that was the first thing that I looked at, actually. Even before effective, I looked for safe. Did anyone die in the vaccine experiments from the vaccines? And the answer to that was no. But in addition, how effective were they? And what I learned was that all three of the vaccines that have been approved, the goal of the studies was how many people had symptomatic COVID and how many people ended up in the hospital, ended up on a ventilator, or died. And what was amazing, and what I don't think has been adequately presented to the public, is that whenever you do a clinical trial, half of the people in a clinical trial get the vaccine and half don't. And the vaccinated people in the clinical trials, which added up to around 50,000 people for those 3 vaccines that have been approved, none of the vaccinated people ended up in the hospital, ended up in the ICU, or died from COVID. That's pretty incredible.
I mean, those are remarkable stats. When we think about the flu shot, for example, right? We all get the flu shot every year, especially in the healthcare. Teachers and other first responders get the flu shot. The stats say the flu shot's really only 30-ish% effective.
Depends on the year, sometimes 30%, sometimes 60%, because the challenge with the flu virus is that there are many strains of it. And so you're basically guessing which are going to be the bad strains that year and trying to adjust the vaccine every year to accommodate for that. But the fact that these vaccines were so super effective was really amazing. And that's why a lot of people, and definitely those of us in medicine, have talked about it as a medical miracle. But the other thing that, I think the other big fear that people have had is how did they do it so fast? There was a lot of concern about that, which is also understandable because it was fast. We were hearing over and over that most vaccines take years to be developed. But what I learned when I did my research and I did my deep dive is that, for example, the mRNA vaccines, yes, that's a new technology for approval for a vaccine, but the research underpinning it had been going on for at least 20 years, and especially in the last 10 years. And they had already done a lot of the groundwork for other coronaviruses like SARS and MERS. So they had figured out that those spikes that everybody knows very well now that are on the surface of the coronavirus should be the target of a vaccine, that's what worked. And, they had been working on vaccines against those viruses, but then those viruses were able to be controlled without the need for a vaccination program. And then there were some other breakthroughs because one of the challenges with mRNA as a substance, right, it's a little bit of genetic material that codes for the spike protein. Both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines work by teaching our cells to make little spike proteins that then our immune system can recognize and attack. So when a real coronavirus comes inside us, they get killed. The technology the challenge was that mRNA is very fragile. And so they were having trouble keeping it stable enough to be in vaccine form. And the breakthrough a few years ago was that they figured out that if they put it in a little glob of fat, that would keep it stable enough, although you had to keep it really cold. And that's why there's this whole thing about really cold refrigerators. But if you did that, you would be able to preserve it and use it for vaccines.
There's obviously concern, you mentioned this is kind of a genetic vaccine, a gene therapy. So folks out there think, if I get this vaccine, that's going to go into my body, into my DNA, and maybe disrupt that and cause some bad adverse effects. Can you kind of speak to why that's actually not possible with this vaccine?
That is a very common question that people have. I think it's understandable that people would want to make sure that their DNA is safe. So mRNA, the Pfizer Moderna vaccines are mRNA vaccines. The mRNA only stays in what's called the cytoplasm of the cell. And the way to think about it is that our DNA is locked in the nucleus of the cell. So it's like in a bank vault, and the mRNA only stays in the lobby. Does not enter the nucleus, doesn't harm our DNA, has nothing to do with our DNA. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine does have actually a little piece of DNA in it. And the way that one works is a harmless inactivated virus is used to get that little tiny piece of DNA into the cell. And then that little piece of DNA, which also doesn't interact or harm our DNA, then also codes for the spike protein. So they both have a similar method in terms of you're basically introducing a recipe for the spike protein into our cells so that our immune system learns the recipe, learns what the bad, or another way to look at it is a mugshot, what the bad guy looks like. The bad guy has spikes on him. When something comes with spikes, attack. And so, and our immune system is a very complicated army of antibodies and immune cells that then attack the bad guys. which are bacteria and viruses.
I love your bank vault analogy. It's very timely given all the money heist enthusiasts out there. So if it's in the lobby, it's safe. It's not going into the vault. It's not disrupting the DNA. It's not going to change who you are as a person. So certainly based on all the data that's come out, it's a very, very safe vaccine. Like I mentioned, 200 million people have been vaccinated in this country with almost zero deaths and very, very low adverse events. So that's certainly telling of how safe and effective this is. You know, we keep going back to herd immunity. We want this. Maybe that's the wrong term to use because we aren't a herd. You know, we migrate, we live in different populations as well. But to achieve that, we need to get 70 to 90%, experts say, vaccinated or with some with immunity. But 13% of Americans say they will definitely not get the vaccine, and 24% is kind of a wait and see, just like some of your patients initially said. So obviously we need to really change this narrative if we're going to move the needle on, quote, herd immunity. So in your experience and in your practice, who are these people? Who are the groups that are either I'm definitely not getting it or wait and see and we'll see what happens?
There is a group of people in our country that are very, very suspicious of vaccines. And not in our country, in our world, there's a lot of fear about vaccines. And really, when you look at the history of vaccines, there's always been a fear of vaccines ever since the very first vaccine hundreds of years ago. I think that for some people, there's something about the idea of doing something to yourself for prevention just really, bothers them. But I think that the difference now versus 200 years ago is the internet and social media. The messaging that's out there is very frightening. And so people are influenced by information that they're getting frequently on the internet. I mean, I have had the situation where I've been sitting in my office and my patient is like, yeah, my mother just sent me another video about the vaccine, so like people are passing on the information. What motivates them? I think that a lot of people have a lot of difficulty sorting out what's reliable information, what's a reliable source. And what a lot of times I think people don't always fully understand perhaps is that some of these rumors are really just that. They're rumors. They're not really based on science. I do feel like, the people that are adamant that they're never going to be vaccinated, even some of those I've been able to convince, but it's the people that are still not confident, that are waiting, that I think are the group that is a little bit different. And so those people, what I have been experiencing is, I just had a long conversation with a patient yesterday about this, for example. I think that the issue is that everybody has different questions, that you can't assume that it's a monolith, that it's one issue. So, for example, many young women have heard things about fertility. And so you have to address their individual questions. And it really requires drilling down to people's individual concerns and individual needs and the things that each individual has heard, which is what makes it more challenging to get those messages out. So the reality is, of course, that the vaccines have no impact on fertility. That's another myth that's out there, but it has spread far and wide. The reality is that, like I mentioned, it doesn't affect our DNA, doesn't affect your ability to have a pregnancy. Many women have gotten vaccinated and become pregnant afterwards. And men have also heard that it causes infertility problems and that causes problems with sexual function. That's also not true. What harms your sexual function is COVID. If you survive COVID, COVID attacks every single part of your body potentially. So that's really the danger.
I do love how you're dispelling a lot of the myths out there. And, there's no more clear example than some of the data that came from Andrew Wakefield and his initial studies on MMR leading to pervasive developmental disorders in children. And we now know through many, many, many refuted studies, and the Lancet actually pulled that article about how the MMR vaccine causes autism. But you're right, social media is like wildfire. Someone hears something and it kind of just spreads throughout the public very quickly without much scientific backing.
So everybody does have different issues. And so, for example, I think that minority communities may have special concerns because of the history of mistreatment in the medical arena and in the medical research arena. Although honestly, that's not the only reason. I literally have had one of my patients that I've had for a long time, African-American women, walked in and said, it's not about Tuskegee, but I do have questions. So, you can't assume that because a person is of color that that's the reason, but certainly the, suspicion or caution, because healthcare and medical research has not always been beneficent to people of color, to poor people. There's been medical experimentation in our country on mentally disabled people, on prisoners, so that unfortunately there is a history of mistreatment, and medical research once upon a time didn't have the safeguards that exist now.
Let's talk about that for a second.
Yeah.
Based on the data, clearly it's, Black, Indigenous, communities of color that have probably been affected the most by the illness. And yet when we see which are the communities who kind of have the greatest vaccine hesitancy, it tends to be those, quote, marginalized communities. And one of the things you mentioned was a history of mistrust and a history of mistreatment in the United States. And, you mentioned Tuskegee. Tell our listeners, tell us a little bit briefly, what was Tuskegee? What were those experiments and the science, and kind of what was the aftermath of that?
Yeah. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment was a study that was conducted by the United States Public Health Service in conjunction with the Tuskegee Institute, which is one of the historically Black institutions of higher education. And it was started in the pre-penicillin time. Syphilis, which is, everybody knows, a sexually transmitted disease, it's treatable by penicillin. But once upon a time, we didn't have penicillin. And syphilis was very, very common across the country and the world. And it was well known that syphilis could cause heart disease and vascular disease and dementia and could kill you. But still, the study was performed supposedly to see what the outcomes were going to be in African-American men with syphilis. But the reasons that this study is infamous is that the men that participated in the study did not consent. They didn't know what was happening. And that even after penicillin was discovered as a treatment for syphilis, they did not receive penicillin, and their syphilis was allowed to continue to ravage their bodies and make them sick. And the only reason that the syphilis study was stopped was because it hit the media, that, Newsweek, 60 Minutes, there was an expose, and everyone was horrified, and the study was stopped. So people cannot necessarily quote to you chapter and verse about the Tuskegee syphilis study. Even doctors aren't all aware of it, of the details. But it's an example of a very egregious thing where there was no informed consent, where treatment was withheld, and bad things happened to people. So many years later, the HIV AIDS epidemic happened. And one of the things that was noted, HIV was affecting minority communities as well as others. And a lot of minority people didn't want to participate in clinical trials of HIV treatments, which is the way that new treatments are studied. And President Clinton actually did a formal apology on the part of the United States government for the Tuskegee syphilis study. Some of the survivors came to the White House for this ceremony of apology. And the reason he did that is that AIDS researchers and public health advocates asked and promoted that he do that, both to encourage people to participate in clinical trials, but also because what people were seeing was that a lot of minority folks were reluctant to take the new AIDS treatments. And what we now know is that those treatments now have converted AIDS from a death sentence to something that can be, you can have a normal lifespan and live pretty much a normal life living with HIV, but that there was a reluctance to take those medicines. And actually, one of my friends, one of our colleagues here at Cornell, Dr. Holcomb, in a session we were doing about COVID vaccination, talked about that because he said, ironically, what that led to was that minority people's life expectancy and survival from AIDS was different because of hesitancy to take those medicines. An amazing medical breakthrough, which was in part actually one of our Cornell infectious disease doctors, our head of ID, Dr. Gulick, was a major part of those studies, and that people suffered and died because of it. And so isn't it ironic that fast forward years later, that we now have a medical breakthrough that can save lives from a disease that has disproportionately also hurt people of color, and that because of hesitancy and fear and suspicion, that people may sacrifice their lives because of that. And so, it's one of the reasons that Kevin, who's an African-American physician, and I, and a lot of us have been doing a zillion community events and educational efforts to just try to answer people's questions, because we know that the concerns are legitimate. These abuses really did happen. And
Right.
It's not just something in the past, 40 years ago. This is something, people are still mistreated in the medical setting today. People still don't have access to medical care today. People still experience racism in every aspect of American life. That is a reality that we have to acknowledge. But even still, this breakthrough of vaccines for COVID is a true medical breakthrough. And I think I really want our communities, all of our communities, to really strongly consider being vaccinated. I really believe it's important. I think it will save lives.
This last year has been, remarkable. The events of 2020, the Black Lives Movement matter for racial injustice. And like I mentioned, the unequal toll of COVID-19 on communities of color. And you said it so eloquently, it's not about convincing people. It's about providing information that is sorely missed. It's about empowerment. It's about access. What did you really mean by that? And how can we shape our community to create that trust that may be lost?
Part of the issue for many communities who have been disenfranchised, who have been impacted not only now by COVID, but by a long history of mistreatment and lack of political and other power, that when you walk in the door and start to try to twist people's arm to do something, A, it doesn't work, B, it's disrespectful. That you really need to step back, that our community, the reason that all of our communities around the world, with all of the adversity that they've had to deal with, have survived, is because they have internal strength and wisdom that has contributed to their survival. And so it's really important for us as doctors to not waltz in and act like we know all the answers. Our role is to provide information because of our scientific training, to listen to people and their concerns, to respect where they're coming from, and not to try to twist their arm or convince them, but to empower them to make their own decisions. That's how you address things like this. And the interesting thing about this issue of trust is that you got to earn trust. It's not something that you should assume because you have a white coat on or an MD after your name that people should trust you, that you have to earn it. And it not just individuals, but healthcare institutions. And that, the sad thing, the tragedy about, and what I think the reason that COVID has just exposed like everything is that when you have a healthcare system that treats people differently because of the color of their skin or the content of their insurance card, then people are going to be skeptical. They're going to wonder, and when you have corporations that sometimes don't do the right thing, one of the suspicions that people have is, well, are pharmaceutical companies just doing this to make a buck and that this is really just a giveaway? That's something I've heard. The reality is that pharmaceutical industries do want to make money. And that's why it's so important that you have regulations and that you have supervision and oversight of drug development and a vaccine development. And that is what we have seen, especially for the COVID vaccines, that there was excruciating care taken to supervise, provide oversight, not rush things, but to do things in an efficient way. A lot of things in healthcare and medical research, are like slow motion, but they revved it up and just put all the resources, all the brain power. Money was no object, and the WHO and American government and the Canadian government and all the developed countries put their resources in, told all the vaccine scientists, get to work, start to work on this, and money is no object. And those public, what they call public-private partnerships, yes, pharmaceutical industry, but also government, those combinations are what have led to these breakthroughs.
You speak on trust, and I completely agree with you about earning trust. I had a really nice conversation with Dr. Ibrahim one of the senior deans of diversity and inclusion here. And we talked about how some trust could be garnered if the health force is reflective of how the community looks. And, you are the principal investigator for the Diversity Center of Excellence here at Weill Cornell Medicine. Tell me a little bit about this center. What is its mission and what are the goals? What are you investigating?
Our Diversity Center of Excellence is part of our Cornell Center for Health Equity. And the Center for Health Equity is, in essence, a virtual center, but it brings together researchers, educators, advocates throughout the Cornell family that are interested in working on issues of health disparities, health equity, et cetera. The Center of Excellence, though, has a special focus on healthcare workforce diversity. It's funded by the Health Resource Service Administration of the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. And the Centers of Excellence program is part of HRSA's mission is around the healthcare safety net. They fund the migrant health clinics. They fund primary care workforce development, but they have had a long commitment to diversity in the healthcare workforce. And diversity in the healthcare workforce is important in part because of issues of trust, which is not to say that that everyone should be cared for by somebody that's of their same ethnicity. A, that would be impossible. B,
I would have no patience if that was the was the rule.
Well, but B, it's not, that's not the thing that's necessary. But when you have a diverse group that's thinking about problems, that's caring for patients, that's doing medical research, diverse groups in any field, business, education, whatever, when you have different perspectives, that is where you make better decisions. And when you have a diverse workforce, that provides safeguards, insights. Medicine is a very hands-on human experience. If you don't have people that have insights into why, for example, people might be hesitant to accept vaccination because of their sort of communal exposure to racism and mistreatment, you're not going to be able to even begin to address how you approach that. But even after the pandemic is over, the issues don't end, right? Because
Right.
a lot of the issues, basically there's a gigantic literature about healthcare disparities that in every sphere of medicine, many times poor people, minority people, women are treated differently. And that we really need to have, everybody needs to have a seat at the table to be able to figure out the solutions to these issues.
I think one thing that we can certainly do better, especially in our medical training, is, medicine is a customer service industry. We learn the science well, we study for MCATs and boards and things like that, but we need to learn how to meet people halfway and put ourselves in their shoes and see what their experiences are so that we can get the best outcome possibly. And one of the projects that you've been working on to specifically address this vaccine hesitancy is the Capstone project. Can you tell us a little bit about the Capstone projects and kind of what has been the outcome of this initiative?
This is one of our favorite things that we are engaging in. So the 6 medical schools in New York City, a lot of us that are working around issues of health equity and diversity all know each other. And we've been working with the Department of Health on provider engagement for community education. And out of that effort, we decided that we all have programs working with young people, encouraging them to consider health careers and providing them with mentoring. And we decided that we would make a new program, and we stood it up over a few weeks for college students, many of them from New York City, many of color or first generation immigrant or other, but we basically, anyone could apply. And we basically invited the application, and we got almost 800 college students from 28 states, Puerto Rico, Washington, and other countries to apply. And then we decided we would just accept everyone. So we've had 2 cohorts. We just started our 2nd cohort. And what we basically decided to do is make a virtual internship, because now with Zoom, you can do that, where students would learn about virology, about pandemics and public health, about COVID specifically, about how the immune system works, how vaccines work, and then how to talk about vaccines. So we didn't want it to only be about the vaccines, but also about the backstory. And
I like how you said backstory there, by the way.
oh, that's right. It is the backstory. And so they each have to produce a capstone project, which is something for social media, which could include a TikTok video, a PowerPoint, an infographic, a song, and post it on social media. And then they also each have to commit to talking to 10 people about COVID vaccination. So that we figured with almost 800 students, that's 8,000 people just with that commitment alone that could be reached. And especially for young people, the next group is young people that is hesitant, right? So like I was saying earlier, it's not only people of color, there's all these different demographic groups. Young people are very hesitant because they know that they're probably less at risk compared to elderly, although young people have unfortunately gotten sick and died from
Sure.
COVID. But the thing that's really important to remind the young people is that you're not, and remind everyone, you're vaccinating for yourself, but you're also vaccinating for your family, the people around you, and the community, and to end the pandemic. It's all of the above, because unless we have a wall of vaccinated people around the most vulnerable, they're not safe. And really, unless we stop the transmission, every time the virus jumps to a new person, that person, then you can have a new strain. And if we have bad new strains, more and more and more of them, ultimately the vaccines may not work. And so you cannot assume that you don't have really a responsibility, I think, to yourself, your family, and the public to consider vaccination.
Even by getting vaccinated early, there is some urgency because, just like you mentioned, if we don't achieve this immunity as a society, that can increase the incidence of variants and mutations and genetic drift that the current vaccine may not even address.
Exactly. And one of the worries is that, we're seeing some terrible, tragic surges of COVID in Brazil, in India, and in other countries. And that part of that is fueled by variants. Unfortunately, in addition, those countries have not had a lot of vaccination access. And so their people are not protected either. We are a global world, right? Whatever's happening elsewhere can happen here. The irony to me is that our sisters and brothers abroad are suffering horribly now, and they don't have access to vaccines. We do, and we're not taking them. It's just a really tragic irony.
One of the things I read recently, specifically about India, obviously, our prayers are with them because of what they're going through right now. And in terms of health inequities and disparities, we took for granted this concept of social distancing, right? We can social distance. We're in America. We have our space. In India, a lot of people don't have that luxury. Many, many people live in cramped quarters, so they don't have the luxury of social distancing. We say, put on a mask. A lot of people in India don't have a mask. We say, wash your hands and use sanitizer. A lot of people in India don't have those resources. So just like what we talked about, meeting people where they are to achieve the best outcome possible, I think a lot of the things that we did take for granted here in the United States for these risk mitigation strategies, they were unable to do so, specifically in India.
And in this country, the communities that were hardest hit were the ones that potentially didn't necessarily have those luxuries. Low-income families, especially families of color, they're frontline workers. They couldn't work from home. B, a lot of people do live in multi-generational households. So you really couldn't necessarily hide out. And I worked in the hospital during the peak here in New York City. And I remember asking people, who lives in your house? And they had a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment with a whole bunch of people in there because that rents are so expensive. So these issues are, the thing about, we have many different countries within our country, I guess is the way I look at it.
Certainly after chatting with you and listening to all the many, many initiatives that you are part of, in order for us to really achieve this herd immunity, we need ambassadors. We need people like yourself to empower the next generation of healthcare workers. We need people to go into the communities and meet them where they are and educate them on the safety and efficacy of the vaccine. You dispelled a few myths about the vaccine to some of our listeners. Right now, the floor is yours. What do you say to all those out there that still have some hesitation, that are still kind of a wait and see group about the vaccine? What do you want to say to them specifically? Go out, it's available, get the vaccine, do it for yourself, do it for your family members.
I'm going to speak to people out there that are hesitating in the way I speak to my patients. This is a message of love. I want everyone to be safe. I truly do believe that the vaccines are safe and effective. And I know that the agonizing that people are doing and trying to make a decision about this is because a lot of it is about fear and anxiety about, am I going to accidentally do something that will harm myself and thus harm my loved ones? I really do not believe that the vaccines are harmful. I think that it's an act of love and also an act of faith to do it. And one of my very beloved patients, actually the same one that said, this is not about Tuskegee. It took me like 15 years to convince her to work with her. I wouldn't say convince, to work with her around getting a flu shot. And it took a while for her to feel comfortable with getting the COVID vaccine. But she's done it. And I was so happy. What I told her was, you've survived breast cancer. You've had children. You've survived childbirth. I know you are a brave person. I know that you can do this. Finally, she was like, okay. So I know that it takes some courage to do something, to do the unknown. But I think the reason I want people to really consider it is you're doing this for yourself, but also for the people that you love. And they need you, you need them. And the only way we're going to be able to get out of this is to do it together.
Dr. Morales, I really appreciate everything you've shared with us today. You've put a smile on my face on certainly how passionate you are about bringing that message, showing your self-love, showing the other members of our community love. At Weill Cornell, New York Presbyterian, I think we've done a phenomenal job of distributing the vaccine to our healthcare force, of course, and also many, many patients. We were kind of the first place up in the Armory to vaccinate a really large group of patients in New York City. So I certainly applaud all the efforts of Weill Cornell and New York Presbyterian. And to all you listeners out there, thank you for tuning in. Today's message was one of love, just like Dr. Morales said. So remember, when it comes to your health and remember when it comes to your wellness, we here at The Backstory have your back. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for listening to The Backstory. Please subscribe, rate the podcast, and review The Backstory on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Play Music. And feel free to share this podcast on social media or even your own website or blog. This podcast is for general information purposes only. It does not constitute the practice of medicine, including the giving of medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of this information is at the user's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for medical advice. To learn more about Dr. Singh and his clinical research, please follow him on social media. You can also sign up for his newsletter by going to www.rickysinghmd.com. That's RICKYSINGHMD.com.